and I'm happy to welcome Giuseppina and Giorgia Coppola from Palermo. And Giuseppina is a full professor for general pedagogy at the Faculty of Education and Science at the Università degli Studi di Palermo. And she is interested in her research in pedagogical physical exercise, training sciences, practices. She contributed a chapter in our conference proceedings for the last time on Dietrich von Hildebrandt's Phenomenology. She wrote a monography, a book on philosophies of education for our times and phenomenological path in phenomenological contribution in Italy, and a chapter on transformative learning meets Bildung called Hermeneutic Phenomenology meets Transformative Learning. It's connected to Miserov and this stuff. So, Giorgia, she is a PhD student at the Health Promotion and Cognitive Science. It's a department of psychology, and her research topics are community pedagogy, general and social pedagogy, family pedagogy, and she's working on her PhD project from burnout to the educated community for pedagogical teacher education. So, we are very happy to welcome you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, and let us first of all thank Malte and all the world around him to organize this symposium, which is an appointment for us by now, and we are very grateful to have the possibility to share learning together. The aim of our presentation today is to explore the interconnection among self, the other, and the world, which is peculiar in many phenomenological approaches, considering the Edith Stein account on empathy and community, and first and foremost considering her account on empathy as a sui generis experiential act. These two topics, empathy and community, were the first themes of the author's philosophical and pedagogical inquiry, namely during the years when she was close to Husserl as his assistant, first in Göttingen and then in Freiburg. She devoted her 1916 doctoral thesis under Husserl's supervision to the theme of empathy, as in its very title, On the Problem of Empathy, and her following work to the theme of community. Actually, the second part of her philosophy of psychology and the humanities orbits around individual and community. Considering such writings, we may argue that, according to Stein, a phenomenological investigation of personhood, and personhood can be considered a main and constant topic, and I quote, requires the study of the individual person in relation to community, since the nature of the person is a going beyond self, and an openness not only to the object world, but also to the world of the other subjects. Empathy is therefore the prerequisite of all true communities, the necessary framework for possible appearance of them, and, as a consequence, of truly personal life. And empathy is that condition precisely because it is envisaged as a sui generis experiential act, as we are going to show in this presentation, hopefully. So, nowadays, there is a quite different idea of empathy, because the term empathy is often meant as an immediate feeling with another person, an emotional and pre-reflexive experience possibly taking place spontaneously and easily. Instead, from the phenomenological standpoint, empathy is understood as the experience of another subjectivity, i.e. a multi-layered process of feeling into another person's experience where we not only understand it, but also share it at an affective level. It is a multi-layered process insofar as it implies the involvement of different stages of my personhood, starting from my bodily experience, my emotion, but also going beyond them, more deeply than them. Edmund Husserl and his disciple Edith Stein, before him, thereby anticipating some future development of his perspective, presented empathy as the unique path of understanding others as intentional beings. This means that only thanks to a genuine and true empathy, we can recognize and appreciate that the other has emotions, goals, values, and desires that are different from me and that shape their personal being in the world. At the same time, by empathizing with the other, the latter broadens my horizon and mainly discloses aspects of my own personhood that without them would remain unexpressed and undeveloped. Moving back to where all this began, to Husserl. Husserl's earliest use of the term Einfühlung dates back to his 1905 lecture on judgment. He quotes Theodor Lipps, pinpointing that he correctly considered empathy as a quasi-judgment and a kind of presentification. As it is well known, according to Husserl, I live the world for the most part within a natural attitude, and in this attitude, I immediately experience myself as part of a world where others are continually in touch with me and affect my lived experience. In my own living and perceiving, indeed, the other living body appears as a natural part of my being in the world. In other terms, the otherness experience blossoms as a natural experience alongside my self-presence. However, for Husserl, Lipps neglects the multi-layered aspect of the constitution of the other and the self. Husserl's specific interest in giving an account of empathy is how the I can recognize and understand the other. In the first book of Ideas, he distinguishes what is given primordially, i.e. experienced in an originary manner, for example, the external things in perception, for example, this glass in front of me, from what is given to us non-primordially, for example, the object given in my memory or expectation. Then he underlines that empathy does not entail an original experience of the inner life of the others. Indeed, empathy is a first-person experience that does not have the same intentional structure of sense perception. This is a very crucial point for us. In his later works, and mainly in the fifth Cartesian meditation, derived from lectures given at Sorbonne in 1929 and first published in French translation in 1931, Husserl adds that the perception of the other as a subject requires what he calls the analogical apprehensions, whereby the other appears via pairing parung, i.e. the external presence as a living body, similar to mine as another 0 point of orientation in the world. As to Edith Stein, her analyses are definitely Husserlian on this point, even if she obviously had not read about Husserl's idea of pairing between bodies when she wrote her dissertation before in 1916. However, as Husserl's assistant in Göttingen and Freiburg, she had the opportunity to become familiar with this account, or better, with its first envisagement. Actually, in her PhD thesis, she writes that we perceive feeling as coming from the lived body and that empathy takes place first as a sensorial empathy, even if this is to be considered only the beginning of a complex process. As to Husserl again, from the analogical apprehensions, the process that Husserl called communalization, whereby the second ego appears to my ego as similar, stems. Actually, when I perceive this organism analogous to me, I live the analogical apprehension enabling me to recognize myself as a human being partaking in a humanity that is shared with others. Let us now consider the PhD thesis by Edith Stein on the problem of empathy. To start with, she considered empathy as a problem due to the lack of a clear definition, which paves the way to her genuinely phenomenological commitment in distinguishes different experiences. Actually, her aim is to provide a phenomenological analysis of the essence of empathy. The specific problem of empathy Stein considered is how can I share certain experience with another person, not just the same kind of experience, but the actual experience itself. Following Husserl, she depicts the difference between primordial or originary and non-primordial or non-original experiences. She therefore describes empathy as an act that is originary as an experience, but non-primordial in context. For example, when I feel the other's joy, I do not experience it primordially as my joy, but as a joy experienced first and foremost by the other. This process, like perception, presents something, of course the experiences of another person, but differs from perception and is similar to other forms of experience, such as expectation and memory. In that the meaning content of the experience is not given directly to the subject, but rather always in a non-original way. And in this way, the other person is the one that appears only in an empathetic act, revealing and sharing with me something of herself, something of himself. This something is a point that I will go back to later. At this point, we may stress that for Stein, empathy not only is an aid to understanding the other emotional life, but is the condition of possible knowledge of an existing external world. Then, in order to gain a clear definition, Stein makes some other distinction and stresses how her account differ from what Leibniz, as well as Adam Smith and the other 18th century moral philosopher, meant when they considered empathy as a projection of my emotion into the other, or a kind of fusion, or an identification with the other. Empathy should not be confused with sharing the same experience, nor is it a case of feeling at one with the other person and merging with another person's experience, insofar as it is crucial to preserve the self-other separateness. Therefore, empathy should not be overlapped with sharing the same or a similar experience in the more common sense. Many, like Husserl, Stein stresses the difference with direct perception. Actually, even if sensual and bodily empathy is the starting point, Edith Stein's account of empathy cannot be considered as a simulationistic one. Namely, according to Stein, Leibniz is right to see that the other's consciousness emerges by analogy with the ego consciousness, but he misses seeing a physical living body having also a psychical and mainly a spiritual life. The body is guided by intentionality, as Massimiliano has stressed before. So imitation is not enough for empathy. For Leibniz, empathy is something like an unconscious instinct of imitation, where observing another person's emotional expression activates a corresponding imitation, so a kinesthetic experience in the observer, leading to a vicarious understanding of their feeling and mental states. Instead, Stein, like Husserl, but more clearly than him, brings together the account of empathy with the idea of the multi-layered structure of human beings. Now the link between the interest in empathy and the one in personhood should be clearer. Actually, the structure of human person, to quote a prominent pedagogical book by Edith Stein, entails three concentric levels of our humanities: body, soul, and spirit. A genuinely empathetic process, indeed, discloses access not only to the other's bodily expression and psychological state, but also to to their spiritual experiences and, as a consequence, to their inner world. The Steinian account of empathy, therefore, can be understood as a peculiar phenomenological overcoming of psychologism, which is today our current hazard in education. Actually, we may ask how many steps in this process. According to Svenus, Stein envisages empathy as a three-step process in which the experiences lived by another person emerge to me as a meaningful through the bodily expression of their emotion and internal states. 2. I then develop an explication of these experiences by following them through an imaginative interpretation of others' internal and inner life. 3. I gain a more comprehensive understanding of the experiences of the other person, feeling with them. However, there is a further step, in our opinion, that should be not forgotten, especially from a pedagogical standpoint. Stein indeed also writes about the significance of empathy for the constitution of power on personhood. Through empathy, what is sleeping in us is developed. This feedback, the empathetic feedback we can say, allows us to understand that being a person means being in a mutual empathetic recognition. In other words, thanks to empathy with different personal structures, we see better what we are and what we are not, and what we are becoming. This approach discloses the reciprocal and dialogical nature of every educational relationship, thereby building a common world. To sum up, Edith Stein highlights empathy as the giveness of foreign subjects and their experiences, and not as a perception, a mere representation, or a neutral positive, but rather as a sui generis presentifying act. However, by empathizing, I grasp, so to speak, I see, or better, I guess, something that is distinctively inaccessible unless in an always incomplete way, since the other's experience will never be an original giveness for me. Actually, by awakening experience that are not original for me, empathy mainly develops in a specific manner my own capacity for feeling, imagining, and understanding, i.e. it involves an affective matching, an intellectual self-centric capacity, and a self-other differentiation whereby a cognitive understanding of person as such and not as I would like him or her to be shall be achieved as far as possible. At this stage, we can consider the main and the deep reason why empathy is not a kind of perception. Each perception is always a physical grasp of one side of, for example, this glass. It entails also empty co-presentation of the here and now inaccessible other sides of the object. Then a perceived object is giving as a whole to us in a series of profiles, insofar as it can potentially be progressively approached by movements to new position. Instead, the other subjectivity will never be totally grasped, regardless of either movements made or position taken by me. Moreover, empathy requires not only my capacity of understanding, but also the other's freedom, revealing and sharing to me, or not, something of their inner world. This implies a clear-cut suggestion for educators and pedagogical researchers, as it prevents them from incurring in any illicit claim to totally understand, to totally grasp and capture the uniqueness of others' first personal experience. More generally, this account allows for many pedagogical claims about world and personhood. Empathy discloses the actual presence of the other's experience even if one does not have first-person access to it. The other world is rather indexed to the empathized experience. How I understand the others inevitably leads to reflection on how I understand, or not understand myself, Empathy with the other can lead us to a deeper self-understanding, and sharing the inner world is always a reciprocal enterprise. Within the framework of this mutual sharing, which take place at different levels of deepness and different levels of awareness, my lived experience is never only mine, insofar as it always implicitly participates in intersubjectivity, because it will be the outcome of an embodied social and unworded experience. Moreover, genuine empathy also implies an ethical requirement, insofar as the Steinian significance of empathy ultimately brings us in striving to respond appropriately to the other. Empathy, finally, is a virtue. Also in phenomenological field research, in particular, educational research entails a first-person perspective, meant as the encounter of different 0 points of orientation, whereby the phenomenological virtues of delicacy, allocentric attention, and hospitality are involved. Fundamentally, the knowledge of the other cannot be verified with evidence in the manner of the perception of a sensible object. Hence, the phenomenological criticism, based as well as Marion being inspiring example of this, to empiristic and reductionistic approaches to personhood as well as to the human world. Thanks to empathy, we are encouraged to consider the very nature of each phenomenological datum in a dialogical reciprocity between the self and the other, and far from any kind of empiric and objectifying gaze. By providing insight into the particularity of another person, empathy does not entail the other person experience full duplication. Each and every person as a singular as well as finite being can never completely grasp the variety and the depth of humanity, and, to put it in the words of another disciple of Husserl's, Emmanuel Levinas, who, as it is well known, attended those lectures on intersubjectivity at Sorbonne University, their exteriority and transcendence. According to Levinas, exteriority is a relation whereby the self is separated from the other and remains transcendent. And as Malte told us yesterday, a negative and an incomplete experience is always an excellent medium of transcendence. Levinas argues for a radical difference that cannot be reduced or assimilated by the self-totality, for an encounter is the basis of a truly ethical relationship, like in the empathetic one and like in the community one. So I give the floor to Giorgia. At this stage, we can maintain that for human being, empathy is a precious and irreplaceable possibility. Experiencing empathy means committing to a genuine and possibly accurate knowledge of other. Empathy is a glimpse of another person's singularity, disclosing her specific possibility of knowledge of the other in his or her irreplaceable uniqueness as well with business community. In her PhD thesis, Stein's final contention is that the perceived world and the empathetic world are different perspectives of the same world. Empathy becomes for the foundation for all intersubjective experience. However, she recognized that there is a need to ground her work. She looked at her study of intersubjectives as a lifetime project, only lightly outlined in the original thesis. Her work in philosophy of psychology and the humanities began to carry out this project. Following the war, Stein gave up her post as Husserl's assistant and completed the manuscript of the philosophy of
psychology, on community, on staying, and writing a substantial amount of material that was later incorporated into an introduction to philosophy. She developed her philosophy of psychology in the contribution around the time of was also editing Giuseppina, and neatly ties in with the later aim of developing a transcendental phenomenological account of the human person. These texts were published together as contribution to the philosophical foundation of psychology and the human science. Starting in part 1 with work on psychical causality, Stein continues in part 2 with a text on individual and community, where she set out to analyze how human possibilities are actualized at individual, community, and political levels. The two main parts of Stein's contribution, psychology, causality, individual and community, were closely relative to one another. A shift from an individual-focused themes, a person's empathy, to social topic can be detected. More deeply, the connection between these texts lies in the overarching project of the work to carve out the ontologic place of the human person in relationship to both the natural and the spiritual world, the latter of which is constituted by social and communal relations. As previously reported in Cartesian meditation, Husserl accounts for a process of communalization. This means that I realize that I am a community of persons through I am just me along with my own lived experience. According to Stein, community should not be understood as an individual pure self, that is a unit consisting of personal qualities, but rather as a set of experience that is as a unit experience originating in the individual self belonging to the community. In this term, the community can be considered an organic connection between the individual self that constitutes a supra-individual subject. The concept of the supra-individual self describes how the individual self is connected to the communal spirit and the larger we, to empathy and the shared experience, rather than remains isolated. This concept encompasses the idea that the human person is not an isolated entity, but finds means and connection through participation in common and spiritual life, moving behind the individual's personal consciousness to encompass a broader shared reality. To put it differently, human beings are fulfilled as individuals through this. Namely, in a community, the individual member does not disappear but retains his or her personality and responsibility. She viewed the concept of community and society differently. The former is the form of human coexistence in which relationships are organic and personal, and the defined criteria are sharing and solidarity. The later, society, is characterized by the relationship of a different kind, mechanical and extrinsic. Namely, examples of community are the family, the school, solidarity network, such as voluntary work. This is a form of sharing one's experience in a common search for meaning, ties capable of producing mutual trust, and which the truthful and the spiritual search in exercised through mutual recognition. In particular, the family as the first example of community represents the privileged place in which to promote the full human flourishing on the person through its intrinsic humanizing potential. The school too, albeit with a different configuration, represents that community context in which the different parts of society work together for the common good and the development of human person. According to Stein, the individual self and the supra-individual self are mutually dependent. The individual self provides the necessary experience and the contact for the constitution of the supra-individual self, while the supra-individual self constitutes it as the subject of the community experience that lives in us the individual subject who belongs to it. In Edith Stein philosophy, external and internal experience are interweighed. The individual self establishes a relationship of mutual dependence with other, with the multitude of individual self that constitutes the community. Actually, the character of the community depends both on the individual particularity of its member and on its typical structure. Conversely, the individual character is shaped by the community as a representative of type in a novel way that cannot only be understood from the perspective of community. The community is understood as a communion of life to the extent the individualism stands before another, not as subject before object, but as people who live together and are simulated by one another's movies. Such a communion of life is possible only on the basis of an original common disposition. In the relationship of communion between two people, two vital flows meet and unite. This process conceived with begin touched by the personality of the other person, which establishes a reciprocal relationship between them. This attitude, which, as we have seen, implies a decentralization of the self in favor of the other, enable the inner self to open up and connect with the other, maintaining his or her ontological separateness. As previously stressed, empathy is a framework of community. Moreover, as Calgando stressed, whereas sociology, political science, and anthropology describe a form of community as they exist in history and external reality. Stein gives the example of the death of a beloved troop leader. One can understand simultaneously what is it for me and another experience the loss of the death through empathy, but one can also have a living experience of community, insofar as one can understand what is for the community as a whole to grieve the loss of the beloved leader. Like empathy notion, community phenomenological notion cannot be understood without considering the structure of the human person. Actually, Stein maintains that for one to live an experience of community, one requires body, psyche, and spirit, and constitutive of the human person to make possible the living of an experience of intense togetherness in solidarity. Therefore, the community unites a plurality of subjects and is the beer of a life fulfilled through this subject. The community has a vital force that nourishes its life. In the life of the community, a work of means open up through the spiritual activities of its members. The community is a living being, an organic and a vital unit. This implies that the sense-making gives birth and means to communities. In Edith Stein's phenomenology, the intersubjective view of the person and the concept of community include a critique of reductionism, empiricism, and individualism. According to this view, individualism approaches are valuable impulse to unite, which consists of liberating the individual from the natural solitude and forming a new super-individual personality that unites the strange ability of the individual with himself. Stein presents an idea of community as a unity of the spiritual being who go out toward each other and reciprocally a spiritual soul as a person who records about herself or himself. Came into a world that lies beyond its own self, a world of thing, person, and events, communicating with this world and receiving its influence. To conclude, we started by affirming that in Stein's perspective, empathy represents a sui generis experiential act, in that it offers us a direct experience of the other, allowing access to their emotional states and inner experience, enable genuine process of understanding the world, broaden ecological horizon, and make it possible to bring the light aspect of one own personhood. Following the thread of philosophical reflection, it's possible to affirm that the community is a sui sui generis word, insofar as it is intrinsically constituted by the sui generis act of empathy. It represents the privileged space in which empathy can fully express itself through intersubjective experience. Within the community, the other appears to me as a subject in a dialogical reciprocity between self and other. Therefore, the Stein's idea of a community entails a further phenomenological critique of empirism, more specifically of the scientific technological reductionism, insofar as genuine community can be understood as a sui generis but truly human word. Thank you very much for your attention.